So we thought we would play that song.
I tell you, I think that song captures
A sense of uncertainty about the time in which it was written that correlates very closely to the uncertainty of the time that was going on in what we read in the scripture just a few minutes ago.
Don't you love it that these apostles who were supposed to know so much, I mean, the founders of the church, you know, that we read twice in these stories, they walked away puzzled. They were puzzled. They were scratching their head, but they were clueless.
Well, why wouldn't they be, right? I mean, and we talked about this the other day. I think sometimes a literary reading of the Gospels is important, where we read the disciples as standing in for us. The disciples express senses and feelings and emotions that we are supposed to really identify with. And so this uncertainty, this mourning of having lost